It was supposed to be an ordinary Saturday morning in the quiet suburban neighborhood of Meadow Ridge. The sun rose gently over rows of manicured lawns, casting soft light on the neatly painted houses. The kind of place where everything looked perfect on the outside but often carried a storm underneath. For John Mason, a recently retired Navy SEAL, this peaceful facade was why he had chosen Meadow Ridge for his family. He wanted stability for his wife, Claire, and their 7-year-old son, Ethan. After years of covert missions and deployments overseas, he thought he had finally left conflict behind. He could not have been more wrong. The Homeowners Association of Meadow Ridge had a reputation. On paper, it was meant to maintain the community's beauty and order. In practice, it was run by a handful of power-drunk board members who treated the bylaws like weapons. Their self-appointed enforcers, a volunteer neighborhood watch they jokingly called HOA cops, were known for harassing residents over trivial infractions, a slightly overgrown hedge, a car parked an inch over a driveway line, or toys left in the yard for too long. People tolerated it out of fear or apathy, but John never imagined it would take things so far. That morning, John was in his garage working on his motorcycle, while Ethan played in the driveway with his toy trucks. Claire had gone out to run errands, leaving father and son to enjoy a rare calm day. That calm shattered when an SUV with the HOA emblem on its side pulled up in front of the house. 3 men in matching polo shirts stepped out, wearing utility belts, not police issue, but stocked with flashlights, radios, and, shockingly, holstered pistols. They carried themselves like authority figures, despite being nothing more than neighborhood busybodies. John looked up, his instinct sharpened from years in combat. Something about their posture was off. They weren't here for a casual chat. The lead man, a heavy-set figure named Rick Donovan, infamous for his aggressive enforcement tactics, strode toward Ethan, who was crouched on the sidewalk. John stepped forward immediately, his voice low and firm, though he hadn't yet raised it. But Donovan's hand moved toward his weapon in an unmistakable gesture of intimidation. John's training took over. In an instant, he assessed the angles, the distance between them, the tension in Donovan's stance. He could see fear behind the man's bluster. The so-called HOA cops barked something about unsafe play areas and community safety violations. John heard none of it. His attention was locked on their hands, their movements, and the horrifying fact that these untrained, self-proclaimed enforcers were armed around a child. His child. When John told Ethan to go inside, Donovan stepped forward as if to block him. That was when things escalated. One of the men actually drew his gun, not at John, but in the direction of Ethan, as if to stop him from leaving. Time froze for a split second. John's pulse didn't rise. Years of combat had taught him to keep his breathing steady, his vision clear, but anger burned deep in his chest. This was a battlefield, yet these amateurs were acting like soldiers, threatening an innocent kid. Before anyone could make a wrong move, John calmly positioned himself between the weapon and his son, his frame like a wall. His voice was even, almost unnervingly calm, as he gave Ethan one last order to run inside. The boy obeyed, disappearing through the garage door just as Claire's car turned the corner at the end of the street. John didn't flinch as Donovan's gun wavered, hands trembling. He didn't have to say who he was or what he was capable of. His presence alone made the man hesitate. Within seconds, a few curious neighbors emerged from their houses, phones in hand, recording the confrontation. The HOA men realized they were suddenly on display. Still, they barked threats about taking action and removing the child from unsafe conditions, throwing around legal terms they didn't understand. John stayed silent, watching every move, already calculating how to dismantle them without laying a hand on anyone. He didn't want violence. He wanted justice. When Claire pulled into the driveway and saw the scene, she was terrified. The men holstered their weapons but doubled down on their threats, claiming they filed a report and involved child services. John knew then that this wasn't over. They weren't just flexing HOA power anymore. They were targeting his family personally. They wanted control, and they thought intimidation would get it. But they didn't know who they were dealing with. As the SUV finally drove off, John could see neighbors whispering, some supportive, others frightened. He stood there in silence, his jaw set, his mind already racing. This was going to end with a warning letter or a fine. The HOA had crossed a line. They had threatened his son. And John Mason, Navy SEAL, wasn't about to let that slide. That night, as Ethan slept and Claire tried to calm her nerves, John sat at the kitchen table reviewing everything he knew about the HOA board. He had spent his life gathering intelligence, and he would do it again. If these men wanted a war, they had just declared it on the wrong person. But John wasn't planning to fight with fists or guns. He would use something far more effective: his training, his discipline, and his ability to outthink and outmaneuver anyone who posed a threat. The first step was simple: find out exactly how far this power trip went. He had to know who was really behind it, and why they were so desperate to control his family. The battle for Meadow Ridge had just begun. By the next morning, John Mason was already in mission mode. Sleep had been light, broken by flashes of last night's confrontation. He had faced warlords and insurgents overseas, but the idea of 3 suburban men pointing a weapon near his child burned hotter than any battlefield memory. This wasn't combat protocol. This was arrogance mixed with ignorance, and it could have gone tragically wrong. John started his investigation the way he had learned during covert assignments, by observing patterns, collecting small details, and piecing them together before making a move. He walked through Meadow Ridge that morning with a cup of coffee in hand, giving the impression of a calm neighbor enjoying the sunrise. In reality, he was studying every car, every face, every curtain that twitched as he passed. People knew something had happened yesterday, but few understood how serious it had been. By mid-morning, John had reviewed the HOA bylaws, stored on a dusty community website. They mentioned nothing about armed neighborhood watch patrols or child safety removals. These men had no real authority, just intimidation and bluster. That made John wonder, why take such a reckless risk over something as simple as a boy playing in his driveway? Later, John visited his old friend Marcus, a local police officer who had served alongside him years ago in the Navy. Over coffee, Marcus quietly confirmed what John suspected. Several residents had already filed complaints about the so-called HOA cops threatening people. The police were frustrated, but the HOA board had political connections and always managed to bury the complaints under claims of community safety enforcement. John dug deeper. Late that night, while the neighborhood slept, he parked 2 streets over and walked silently past Rick Donovan's house. Years of training made his steps soundless on the pavement. Donovan's driveway was crowded with vehicles far nicer than his HOA salary should allow. John made note of license plates, security cameras, and visitors who came and went at odd hours. Something didn't fit. Over the next few days, John gathered information on each of the 3 men involved. One of them, Carl Becker, had recently taken out a suspiciously large loan. Another, Steve Graham, was known to bully elderly neighbors into paying fines in cash, fines that never appeared on HOA records. The pattern became clear. This wasn't about enforcing community standards. It was about control, money, and power, and they were willing to use fear, even guns, to get it. Meanwhile, Claire tried to keep life normal for Ethan, but the boy had started waking up at night, afraid to go outside. Claire urged John to stay calm and avoid provoking the HOA further. John agreed outwardly, but inside, he knew he had to dismantle this threat piece by piece before it reached anyone else's family. A break came when John intercepted an HOA email chain from a friendly neighbor on the inside. In it, Rick Donovan bragged about tightening the leash on residents who won't play by the rules. There was also a cryptic mention of removing obstacles and making examples. John's instincts sharpened. These men were planning something bigger, and his family had been chosen as the test case. John knew what to do. He had no interest in fistfights or shouting matches at board meetings. Instead, he would strike where they were weakest, their arrogance and their paper trail. He began compiling every shred of evidence: photos, timestamps, witness accounts, even footage from neighbor security cameras showing the gun being drawn near Ethan. He documented everything with military precision. But while John worked in the shadows, the HOA made its next move in the open. Just 3 days after the confrontation, John received an official letter, a notice of community violation for endangering a minor. The letter claimed the HOA was legally obligated to report John to Child Protective Services. The language was aggressive, dripping with threats of legal action and forced removal of Ethan for his own safety. For most people, this letter would have been terrifying. For John, it was confirmation that his enemies had overplayed their hand. He smiled faintly as he tucked the letter into his growing evidence file. They thought they could scare him into submission. They had no idea they were dealing with someone trained to keep calm under sniper fire. The next HOA meeting was scheduled for Friday evening in the clubhouse. John planned to attend, but not to argue or plead his case. He would gather intelligence, watch their reactions, and map out who really called the shots behind Donovan and his crew. What John didn't expect was just how deep the corruption ran. As the day of the meeting approached, John prepared as though he were heading into an operation. His calm demeanor hid the storm brewing inside. These men had threatened his child, and now they were threatening to tear his family apart with lies. They believed their titles and guns made them untouchable. They were about to learn what it meant to provoke a Navy SEAL. The clubhouse filled with angry neighbors. John arrived calm, carrying evidence. Donovan and his crew tried to accuse him of endangering Ethan, but video footage showing a gun changed everything. John exposed their illegal patrols and extortion schemes. Neighbors turned on the board, police were called, and a reporter documented it all. Donovan's power cracked, but John knew this fight wasn't over. The next move would come in the shadows.